Hi, I'm Gabby and I'm an economist at the RBA. This video is part of a series on the Australian dollar exchange rate. In this introductory video, I will talk about how the exchange rate is measured. In future videos, we will look at why the exchange rate matters for Australia's economy and what factors might cause the Australian dollar exchange rate to change. But first, what is an exchange rate? An exchange rate tells us how many units of currency or money in one economy can be exchanged for 1 unit of currency in another economy. This tells us the value of one currency relative to the value of another. Therefore, we can think about the exchange rate as the relative price of money between economies. Exchange rates help us translate how much something in one currency is worth in another currency, like how much a mobile phone for sale online in US dollars would cost in Australian dollars. Let's now consider this with an example. Let's say that I have 100 Australian dollars, commonly abbreviated to AUD. I want to change my Aussie dollars into US dollars, abbreviated to USD. Let's say to buy that phone online, which is listed in US dollars. In this example, upon exchanging my 100 Aussie dollars, I receive 70 US dollars in return. This means that for every 1 Aussie dollar I gave, I received 0.7 US dollars, or 70 US cents. If we rearrange this equation, we can get this number by dividing the 70 US dollars that we received by the 100 Australian dollars we gave. So the Australian dollar exchange rate with the US dollar is 70 cents. We can also think about the exchange rate the other way around. That is, I only need 70 US cents to buy 1 Australian dollar. We typically write exchange rates using their abbreviations, so in this case, AUD to USD. You can read this as 1 Australian dollar equals this many US dollars. The Australian dollar exchange rate with the US dollar is what we most often talk about and is what you will see most on the news. When people refer to the Australian dollar or the Aussie in the context of exchange rates, they often mean the Australian dollar exchange rate. This kind of exchange rate is called a bilateral exchange rate. Bilateral means comparing two things. So a bilateral exchange rate compares the value of one currency against the value of another one. Bilateral rates are the most common way to measure exchange rates, and they most often compare currencies against the US dollar. This is because the US dollar is the most traded currency globally. Since many currencies are compared with the US dollar, we can use two different bilateral rates with the US dollar to calculate another type of exchange rate, called a cross exchange rate, or cross rate for short. We might want to use a cross rate if we wanted to compare the value of two non-US dollar currencies directly. Say, for example, I want to buy a phone for sale in euros, and I need to know how many Australian dollars it will cost me. I then want to know the exchange rate between the Australian dollar and the euro, right? But what if I only know bilateral exchange rates for the Australian dollar and the euro against the US dollar, but not against each other? What I can do is to use the two exchange rates that I do have to calculate a cross rate, which will be the Australian dollar to euro exchange rate. So let's say that the Australian US dollar exchange rate is 0.7. And now let's say that the US dollar euro exchange rate is equal to 0.8. If we multiply these two fractions together, the US dollars cancel out to give us the Australian dollar euro exchange rate. Multiplying the numbers, so 0.7 times 0.8, we then get 0.56. This cross rate tells us that 1 Australian dollar buys 0.56 euros. Bilateral and cross rates tell us how much one currency is worth relative to another one. But we may want a broader measure of the value of a currency, say how much the Australian dollar is worth compared with a group of other currencies. A trade-weighted index, abbreviated to TWI or TWI, can tell us this. The TWI compares the value of the Australian dollar against a group or basket of other currencies. The importance or weight of the currencies in the TWI basket depends on how much Australia trades with them. China, Japan, the US and the Euro area make up around 60% of Australia's TWI. The TWI is a useful measure of the exchange rate because it measures how the value of the Australian dollar changes relative to the countries we are actually exchanging money with when we trade with them. When we talk about movements or changes in the value of the Australian dollar, instead of talking about increases or decreases in the exchange rate, we instead talk about appreciation or depreciation. An appreciation or depreciation refers to a change in monetary value. In this case, we are talking about the change in the value of one currency compared to another currency or group of currencies. So an appreciation means that the Australian dollar has become more valuable relative to the US dollar than it was before. Because it is now worth more than before, it can purchase a greater quantity of another currency. So in other words, its purchasing power has increased. What does an appreciation of the Australian dollar look like? Following our earlier example, let's now assume that the Australian dollar has appreciated, and my 100 Australian dollars from earlier can now be exchanged for 80 US dollars instead of 70. My 100 Australian dollars are now more valuable because they can now be exchanged for more US dollars than before. The Australian dollar exchange rate is now 0.8. The movement in the exchange rate from 0.7 to 0.8 is an appreciation of 14%. In contrast, a depreciation in the Australian dollar would mean that a given amount of Australian dollars is now worth less US dollars. So let's look at some data now. This chart shows some different measures of the Australian dollar exchange rate. The red line is the bilateral exchange rate with the US dollar. The scale for this is on the right-hand axis. The black line is the Australian dollar TWI, shown on the left-hand axis. We show the TWI as an index because we're grouping out lots of different exchange rates together. For example, Chinese renminbi, US dollars, and the Japanese yen. You can see these two exchange rates don't always move by exactly the same amount. This is because the US dollar, in red, makes up only a small amount of Australia's trade activity, roughly 10%. This means that it has only a small weight in the TWI in black. However, because the US dollar is such an important currency globally, the two still move together much of the time. You can also see on this chart how the dollar appreciates and depreciates. Some particularly large movements have happened around important economic events. For example, during the financial crisis in 2008, the Australian dollar depreciated and then appreciated again in 2009. More recently, you can see the exchange rate has moved in a similar way in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's all for this video. If you want to learn more about measuring exchange rates, see our explainer, Exchange Rates and Their Measurement. In the coming videos, we will discuss why the exchange rate might change and how this is expected to affect the economy. See you next time.